Aditi, please look at the chat. Kalpana ji, you will need to turn your video on so that I can put the spotlight on you.
I'll do that. I'll do that.
Ma.
Yeah, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. So should we wait a few more minutes for participants to join? A couple of minutes? Your call.
How many participants are there already?
Right now,
There are 9.
7. There are 9, including us.
Mm.
Do we wait for 2 more minutes?
Absolutely, we'll do that.
Kalpana ji, let us begin the session, okay? So,
Okay.
I'll start. So, welcome everybody and good afternoon. Let me introduce to you your chair for this session. So, Professor Kalpana Brar is a professor in the Department of Chemistry, Colonial College, University of Delhi. She has been with the college since 1990. She's done her MPhil and her PhD both from the University of Delhi. Her ongoing research and areas of research interest are developing newer formulations of inhibitors for the corrosion of mild steel, designing and engineering more efficient inhibitors, and studying structure efficiency relationships of various inhibitors. She has professional associations with several organizations, some key ones being the Indian Society of Analytical Scientists, the Association of Chemistry Teachers, and the Indian Science Congress Association. She has several publications to her credit, which are refereed close to more than about 30 articles, books published, and so on. And besides this, she's a recipient of several awards and honors, a national scholarship by the government of the NCT of Delhi in MSc. She has also received the Dr. S. Radhakrishnan Award. Among her other experiences, she's guided several projects and led them as the principal investigator of a UGC-funded major project, for instance, entitled Quantum Chemical Calculations for Rationalizing the Selection of Corrosion inhibitor. She's been a visiting faculty and professor to universities overseas, a key one being the Department of Material Science in Seoul. She's a member on the editorial board of Indian Surface Finishing on the reviewers panel for various international scientific journals. And of course, a deputy proctor for the University of Delhi and member of the SH Committee, University of Delhi. So welcome, Professor Brar, and I invite you to please start the session. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Shilpa, for such a generous introduction of me. I always wondered as a science person, how can I contribute and where can I contribute? And thanks to Someshwar Sati for introducing me to the Disability Center and for teaching me or helping me in learning about the disability studies, which goes on not only in India, but abroad too. So I am honored to be a part of this particular session, as well as involved as a member in the center also. So I think today's first technical session, I start the session by inviting Enrica let me just pronounce it properly, Zaninotto. So Enrica, welcome to the session. And in fact, her lecture will be on Advertising the Freak, Marginalisation and Transgression in Victorian Disability Narratives. So I'm looking forward, and I'm sure we'll all be enriched by what she has to say. So over to Enrica for starting the technical session. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I want to start by thanking the organizing committee for letting me present my research today. Can you hear me? First of all, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. As I was saying, my research deals with the representation and the way in which disability is portrayed in Victorian disability narratives in order to strengthen this sense of marginalization. I want to start, first of all, by saying that encountering representations of disability in literature is extremely frequent, and as a matter of fact, such pervasiveness of disability in narratives applies, we can say, to all ages, starting from medieval to postmodern literature. And in fact, references to different kinds of disability can be easily found in every literature, specifically in novels written from the 19th century on. And since, of course, we know that the most, not let's say the most common, but the most well-known kind of disability is physical and therefore linked to wheelchair, we can find a huge amount, a huge presence of wheelchairs in Victorian disability narratives. Indeed, the first approaches to literary disability studies and therefore cultural disability studies have observed a considerable contradiction which is present in all disability narratives. In fact, despite this huge abundance of disability in literature, the social marginalization of non-disabled people persisted in all major cultural contexts. Thus, we can say that it is undeniable that while including impaired people in Victorian literature as a reflection of real historical accounts linked to this huge demographic growth of non-able-bodied, disability narratives reinforced the ideological concepts of normativity applied to the human body. Therefore, given these premises, it should not be surprising that ableism is mainly responsible for such dualistic portrayal of disabled people in Victorian narratives. In fact, from this point of view, we can argue, or at least I argue personally, that ableism can be said to have played the same role along patriarchy, colonialism, racism, and sexism in increasing discriminations, prejudices, and social marginalization against oppressed minorities for centuries. Indeed, due to such ideology, it is extremely rare to find disability narratives that challenge and question the social perception of physical dysfunctions. On the contrary, this marginalization has been identified with the technical term of narrative processes coined by Mitchell and Snyder, precisely in order to describe the way in which these ableist presuppositions are invoked in literature and precisely in 19th century novels as technical devices of characterization. The expression narrative processes indicates that, and I quote, that disability has been used throughout history as a crutch upon which literary narratives lean for the representation of power, disrupted potentially and analytical insight. Hence, disability aesthetic permeates literary narratives as well as films to the point that it turns into, we can say, a necessary metaphor. Therefore, it has been noticed that the rendering of disability in narratives serves precisely as a vehicle to reinforce the concept of normacy by giving more evidence to the overall plot and especially to non-disabled characters. Such ideology can be found, according to Mitchell and Snyder, as far as English literature is concerned in Catherine Dan's G. Love and in Nervy's Moby Dick. Consequently, if we can argue that narrative processes are metaphorically introduced so as to signal deviance and disturbance as far as body appearance is concerned, they cannot but be conservative literary devices. The crucial role that narrative processes play in the stereotypical framework defining the social perception of disability can be easily understood if noticing that after conveying disquieting and unconscious feelings, narrative processes are taken away in order to restore the conventional setting outlined by normativity. This is precisely, among others, what happens in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre when Mr. Rochester recovers his sight at the end of the novel. Broadly speaking, moreover, there have been several debates around such employment of disability as a metaphor in literature, in particular during the first wave of writing in literary disability studies. Scholars have pointed out how disability in narratives follows predominantly a theoretical and marginalizing scheme, aiming potentially at creating emotional involvement in the reader. It is therefore no surprise that, on the one hand, it is possible to argue that disability can signal compassion, culpability, and as well as vulnerability, but on the other, it can be a marker of heroic traits. As a consequence, leading scholar Lana Davis suggestion seems to agree, let's say, with Mitchell and Snyder critical approach. It is always Davis, in fact, who highlights the importance that 19th century had in shaping the literary representation of disability. Indeed, as widely discussed, Davis identifies the year 1855 as the historical climax after which the medical statistical idea of the norm enters the English language, causing a significant shift in the cultural conception of normacy during the following decades. The increasing presence of disabled bodies in Victorian literature can therefore only be explained in relation to the historical context. Due to the Industrial Revolution, Victorian British society was characterized by a demographic explosion in the number of impaired people, becoming predominantly disabled was in fact easier. It mainly happened in factories and in workhouses. Consequently, it was industrial work that mainly marked the distinction between disabled and able-bodied. The social prestige of afflicted was therefore shaped mainly by economy. Disability turned out to be a common, but at the same time marginalizing phenomenon in the life of Victorian people. Hence, disabled bodies frequently appeared in journals and popular fiction. It follows then it is in 19th century novels that it is possible to encounter the best and most stereotypical depiction of disability as a transgressive perception of the human body. From this point of view, we can mention, among others, Flaubert, Madame Bovary, as one of the most representative examples of disability narratives. As a matter of fact, in all 19th century novels, characters usually tend to be common people placed in unusual circumstances. Disability is a transgressive device used to reinforce normativity. It should be no surprise then that the narrative structure of the novel itself serves, according to scholars, and for me as well, of course, to openly advertise a normative conception of the human body. Abnormality is therefore displayed in novels in order to strengthen the public sense of the norm. As a consequence, what 19th century novels do is representing emblematically reality, unconsciously helping the reader to recognize and internalize normative structures present in the world. Thus, the meatiness of life and the meatiness of material body is created in symbolic form and then reproduced symbolically. This normativity in narrative will be by definition, create the abnormal, the other, the disabled, the native, the colonial subject. There is no doubt, therefore, that fiction worked during the Victorian age as a conservative archetype. This doctrine is displayed and applied not only to those to those narratives marked by the presence of physically impaired characters, but on the contrary to all novels during this period of time. Concurrently, it has been suggested that there may be an interdependent connection between the public display of visible physical impairments in 19th century fiction and the cultural phenomenon of the freak show. In fact, as I suppose most of us know, the phenomenon of freak shows was extremely popular in the United Kingdom during the 19th century, as it served to openly display and advertise what was conceived as abnormal. Indeed, such ostentation of disability in 19th century novel is directly subordinated to social approaches towards impaired people. The main aim of the freak show was in fact precisely that of publicly performing people with visible physical disability, who were also referred as the defective, in order to reinforce conservative values related to stereotypical beauty standards based, of course, on body normativity. Therefore, by highlighting this objectification of non-able-bodied, both in real life and in fictional frameworks. It has been suggested that disabled characters are unconsciously portrayed as freaks in all Victorian narratives. Therefore, what follows is that Victorian novels marked by the presence of impaired characters can be said to be a public advertisement of non-normative bodies. Consequently, as already widely explained, once again we find that all the various formal devices employed in Victorian narratives turn out to be meaningful and intended to answer to moral predicaments. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Enrica. Shall we take the questions right now, or we take it at the end of the session?
I think at the end of the session, Kalpana ji, if you like.
Right. I think we'll take up the questions and we'll have a discussion towards the end of the session. So thank you for your presentation. Our second technical session is by Tirtha Pratim Dev. And Tirtha, just give me a second. Yeah. Yeah, Tirtha Pratim Dev. And he is a junior research fellow at the Department of Cultural Studies, the English and a Foreign Language University, Hyderabad. His academic writings have been published in journals such as Sangalp and Essays and Stories. His research interests align along disability histories, cultural studies, and literature of the body. Today, he's going to speak on transgression in a classroom, indigenous education, vocation, and care for the disabled in late colonial Bengal. So over to you, Tirtha, so that you can give your presentation. The Zoom is all yours.
Am I audible? I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are, Tirtha.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. Ma'am has already mentioned the title of my paper. Now, in the first part of the paper, I try to contextualize the notion of charity and reformation, which had been a discursive force around the creation of institutions such as asylums and hospitals in colonial India. In the second and third parts, I look at the cultural processes which negotiated the exchange of knowledges between the colony and the metropole, situating transgressions in the indigenous negotiations of the same. The cultural fascination with normativity in biological, social, and civic life formed the bedrock for the project of institutional intervention within the lives of disabled subjects in colonial India. Existing literature on institutional as well as missionary and secular endeavors underscore how they presume this non-normativity of the body and mind as being detrimental towards the complete formation of a rational functioning subject. As a result, 19th century responses to physical and mental alterity often took the shape of organized charity, or what Henry Jacques Stryker refers to as private benevolence. Often it was the landed aristocracy in India that would directly contribute to the establishment and functioning of institutions such as asylums and charitable societies. Quoting an excerpt from Rajat Sanyal, who writes about the involvement of Indians in organized charity in the late 19th century, M. Miles mentions how Dwarkanath Tagore had contributed 1 lakh rupees to the District Charitable Society in 1838, which eventually led to the creation of a fund from which pensions were disbursed to blind persons in around that period. Thus, the direct engagement of colonial institutions with disabled natives, while arguably beneficial to some extent, also existed within the same cultural register as the asylum and the hospital. One fleeting reference to this can be found in Priscilla Chapman's 1839 book, Hindu Female Education. Writing about a public examination held in December 1826 by the Central School for the Education of Native Females near Calcutta, Chapman notes that one of the girls who exhibited considerable interest was a, I quote, poor blind girl who had from listening to the other children got by heart many passages from the Gospels and repeated very correctly the greater part of the second chapter of St. Luke, end quote. With respect to the pedagogical process, there was no formal method or practice of teaching disabled children. As the excerpt above shows, disabled children were simply integrated with non-disabled ones, and methods such as oral repetition were used to conduct lessons. Yet by 1838 or 1839, one of the first instances of teaching the disabled in India using specialized methods was documented. As Miles writes, I quote, the presence of such children and the lack of any special means to assist their education concerned some teachers at the Bengal Military Orphan Institution, Calcutta, who in 1838 or 1839 requested help from the London Society for teaching the blind to read, end quote. Miles notes how by 1840, the orphans at the asylum were learning to read using Lucas's system of embossing through materials supplied by the London Society. Now, it must be noted that such a cultural infrastructure designated the disabled person, particularly the disabled child, as the locus of a charitable enterprise, which would sometimes be overwhelmingly religious. Whether the mode of affecting change was religious or secular, there remained a deeply rooted desire to transform and reintegrate disabled people as rational and functional subjects of the empire. It might be pertinent to note another thread of study which has located the ambivalences evident in the establishment of colonial institutions, particularly with respect to the ethical and moral intent of the actors involved. The inception of schools and vocational centers was a complex process, not least because of the minutiae involved in securing patronage, funding, and students. Thus, it might be necessary to extend the argument of colonial assimilation to highlight the motivations of the multitude of actors, be those singular individuals or private and public organizations. In an article, Miles mentions the foundational work of Reverend Andrew Bell of the Madras Military Orphan Asylum, whose pedagogical insight reformulated the practice of educating children whose mental and psychological alterities often put them at odds with the rest of the classroom. However, Bell's initiative of including students of different mental and cognitive skills was in direct opposition to the system of behavioral and physical assessment, whose deployment at the asylum through screening techniques was essential towards maintaining the circulation of charity donations and finances. Bell's negotiation of the meaning and possibilities of the term self-supporting citizen, therefore, interrupts the cultural register of charity and disability with respect to colonial institutions. Drawing from this instance, it might be possible to surmise the ambivalences existing within colonial discourses of the aberrant body and mind. Individual initiatives, whether belonging to or separate from missionary and secular projects, complicated 19th century understandings of charity, engendering the bare threads of a disruption in the sociocultural order that designated a fixed meaning to disability. Yet conceptualizing resistance through these indices is not devoid of the overarching structure of colonial institutions and their push towards modernity and progress. Therefore, the idea of transgression can be complicated by situating such disruptive figures within the formal framework of colonial pedagogy and its efforts at disbursing charitable aid and inclusive education, which eventually led to certain individual actors attaining sociopolitical agency. For instance, Priscilla Chapman's Hindu female education, which was mentioned above, mentions a deaf-mute girl by the name of Ganga, who had been admitted to Mary Ann Cook Wilson's orphan refuge at Agarpara near Calcutta under peculiar circumstances. In declamatory terms, Chapman observes the manifold qualities of Ganga, where her social and mental development seems to have taken place despite her disability. Ganga's personhood becomes a site upon which the transformatory potential of the orphan refuge is directed. It is only through the tangible presence of Ganga's disability that the author can present the claims of the orphan refuge as an institution that benefits and uplifts a population deemed to be disadvantaged. Despite the ideological underpinnings which inform a social progress, one can discern slight moments of agency, such as when Ganga is said to have used a system of informal signing to communicate with her peers in the absence of any formal pedagogical and communicative tools. Such instances of transgressing normative notions of embodiment and education become more prominent when we investigate the histories of indigenous responses to disablement through the establishment of educational and vocational enterprises. Now, the next section would deal with the incursions made through the vernacularization of special education. In the late 19th century, disability came to be refigured through the efforts of certain pioneering teachers and officials who had a pivotal role to play in the establishment of its consciousness as a political and transgressive category. The likes of individuals such as Jamaninath Banerjee, Ramananda Chatterjee, Mohini Mohan Mukherjee, Subhash Chandra Roy, and Lal Behari Shah were involved either directly or indirectly in reformulating the discourse around disability through their foundational attempts at facilitating educational and vocational methods for the disabled. While on the one hand, it cannot be denied that missionary organizations and colonial institutions were instrumental in effacing the boundaries between Western methods and Indian subjects, what needs to be underscored is the ambiguity in their ethico-political intent. Apart from accounting for the social inroads provided by the vernacularization of embossed scripts and oral techniques, the process of imbibing and borrowing of colonial and missionary knowledges by native schools makes the boundaries between them more fragile and porous. This cultural space, therefore, complicates notions of resistance by pointing out how local schools for the disabled were themselves rooted in knowledges and methods derived from the metropole. Moon's lettering had made its foray into the system of blind education in India through its transcription into Urdu. William Moon writes about sending 500 copies of the Gospel of Saint Matthew, along with other portions of the scripture in Urdu for the use of, I quote, the blind of North India, end quote. Yet Jane Leopold, who was involved with the children of the orphan institution at Sigra in Banaras, noticed how some of the inmates could not comprehend Moon's Urdu transcription because they were not conversant in Urdu. This impelled her to devise an alphabet adapted to Hindi, and eventually she commenced the printing of the first Hindi reader in Moon's script, the responsibility for which she conferred upon an orphan who was also a bookbinder by trade. One can read through the ideological moorings of novelty that the introduction of a specialized script for the blind brought about in colonial India, such as when Carl Leopold writes that, I quote, the native gentry were very much interested when reading for the blind was first introduced. They could not conceive how it was possible for the blind to learn to read, and many came to our house to test it, end quote. Such forms of fascination and wonder foregrounded the cultural balance that ability carried, both with respect to native ideas of ability and colonial notions of reinscribing the disabled as a functioning subject. Nevertheless, the vernacularization of Moon's script was not limited to Hindi and Urdu. R. Meldrum accounts in his 1883 book, Light on Dark Paths, of several other books in Indian languages bearing Moon's embossed type. The list mentions the printing of the Gospels of St. John, St. Matthew, and Psalm 34 in Hindustani, chapters 3 and 14 of the Gospel of St. John, and chapter 15 of the Gospel of St. Luke in Bengali, and chapter 3 of the Gospel of St. John in Malayalam, Tamil, and Punjabi. By the next decade, the dissemination of Braille into vernacular alphabets for teaching of the blind had already been effected. Sarah Hewlett's book, They Shall See His Face, bears a photograph of one Miss Asho, a student from Lahore who had eventually turned to the profession of teaching the blind at the institute attached to St. Catherine's Hospital, Amritsar. Asho is seen in, I quote, in a fine, clear photograph, sitting in a cane armchair with an open book, her on her right hand, reading the Moon or Braille script, end quote. One iteration of Braille in vernacular was the Sherif Urdu Braille, which had been adapted by Mrs. F.A.P. Sherif in 1891, whose viability had been approved by the British and Foreign Blind Association. Another instance of vernacularization occurred in Tamil Nadu when Anne Jane Asquith, teaching at the Sarah Tucker institutions at Palamkota, devised a Braille script in Tamil, using which she had transcribed books such as the Bible, the Prayer Book, and the Pilgrim's Progress. The colonial logic of assimilating vernaculars under one broad alphabet had been the intent behind Knowles and Garthwaite's book, Oriental Braille, One Alphabet for the Blind of All Oriental Languages, which was published in 1902. The conceptualization of Oriental Braille as a I quote, uniform blind alphabet for all the languages of India and the East, end quote, presumed an imagined space where the heterogeneity of vernaculars is subsumed within a colonial logic of regularity, which would facilitate access. The most significant feature of this ideological shift through Oriental Braille, however, remains the missionary impulse to derive a cultural value of blindness from biblical representations. The third and final part would talk about indigenous processes with respect to Bengal of disrupting a colonial normativity of the body. Now, Garthwaite had some influential bearing upon the thought of one Lal Bihari Shah, whom he had met in 1894. Shah, who would later found, who found the Calcutta Blind School the same year, had initially started with just one student, and that too one whose family received a daily allowance of 2 annas and 2 paise for sending the young blind girl to Shah's tiny house at 154 Karaya Road in Calcutta. Garthwaite might also have influenced Shah to transcribe Braille lettering into the Bengali alphabet, which eventually bore the name of Shah Braille. Yet Subhash Chandra Roy credits Ramananda Chatterjee with devising Braille in Bengali a couple of years before Lal Bihari Shah. According to Roy, a chart bearing the Bengali Braille code appeared in the second issue of the journal Dasi, which had been run and edited by Chatterjee since 1892. This journal, Dashi, was the print mouthpiece of Dashashram, a social welfare organization which was at the center of philanthropic activity by the Brahmo Samaj. Public benevolence and philanthropy through the bodies of the disabled and the socially indigent, therefore, rerouted the nationalistic impulse towards that indigenous modernity in the late 19th and early 20th century. Needless to say, one of the instruments through which this was affected was the medium of print. While Dasi served to bring into circulation the issue of education and social upliftment of the blind, along with another magazine, another journal, the Modern Review, Mohini Mohan Majumdar's Mukh Shiksha brought into the public sphere an iteration of the history and educational methods of the deaf. Mohini Mohan Majumdar had been one of the founding members of the Calcutta Deaf and Dumb School in 1891. Mukh Shiksha, which had come out in 1903, was composed of 3 parts and was in its contents an explication of the methods of teaching the deaf that had been prevalent mostly in the West, but also in the rest of India. The first section presents a history of deaf education in the world, beginning with the same in Europe and the United States, and then narrowing down to the specific and local context of India and finally Bengal. The second section is almost entirely pedagogical in its nature and reads like a manual with instructions on oral techniques of teaching the deaf. The final section is a collection of biographies of some eminent deaf personalities, although its scope is also localized through, I quote, short notes about 2 pupils and about the career of 2 former students of the Calcutta Deaf School, end quote. Although intended as an educational manual, Majumdar's book coalesces the progressing histories of deaf education in Europe and the United States with the personal histories of deaf individuals who have achieved a social reputation through their accomplishments. Yet by interspersing these histories with the local narratives of students from Calcutta, Majumdar underscores the ambivalence prevalent in conceptions and articulations of native and Western. The liminal cultural space where this negotiation happens through the transfer of methods and knowledges between the metropole and the colony fashions the emergence of a deaf subjectivity and complicates the notion of community formation. This ambivalence is perpetuated through the narrative's detailed explication of oralism. Majumdar is not directly apprehensive about sign language, however, or manual methods of teaching. In fact, he simply reduces their incidence within the text to a fleeting mention of other methods of teaching the deaf, as opposed to the primary emphasis on oral processes. Despite this, signing and finger spelling finds mention in the preface of the narrative as one of the primary methods through which deaf solidarity within churches and clubs is maintained in the West. In fact, Miles writes about Majumdar that, I quote, one of the senior Calcutta teachers continued to favor manual methods, but the tide was strongly contrary. Continuing with an excerpt from S.N. Banerjee, the son of Jamininath Banerjee, the erstwhile principal of the Calcutta School for the Deaf, Miles documents. Begin quote, 50 years later, Banerjee's son reported that the late Mohini Mohan Majumdar was a brilliant exponent of sign language. He often told me that my father was an idealist and would not have anything to do with signs. Although the usage of both formal and informal signing in different parts of India has been recorded, such as at the schools in Bombay and in Palamkota, the uneasy shadow of oralism pervaded pedagogical practices for the deaf. T.A. Walsh had departed from manual methods of teaching and had adopted oral methods for the same by the time he had arrived at the Bombay School in October 1884. Florence Swenson, who had initially favored the manual method of communication through signs, even going to the extent of writing about the liberal usage of sign language in the church services of the Palamkota School, eventually reverted to oral techniques since sign language, she noted, was against the trend. Despite the cultural predominance of oralism within classrooms, informal signing flourished among deaf pupils. The use of non-formal sign language among the students of the Calcutta School for the Deaf have been documented to have led Zaninotto Banerjee to remark at their inventive faculty and to note how the gestural communication represented, I quote, something like a language, end quote. These instances underline the liminality that came to characterize methods of instruction and communication in deaf schools in colonial Bengal. Oralism's hegemonic expanse pervaded the cultural sphere of deaf education in the late 19th century, and the continuation of that lineage in indigenous context highlights a transactional space where the exchange of knowledges between the metropole and the colony existed. Zaninotto Banerjee, who would become the principal of the Calcutta School for the Deaf, is documented as having initially traveled to the school at Bombay and, unsatisfied at his progress there, having traveled to London to attend Van Praag's training school in 1894, and then to Washington to attend Gallaudet College. Oralism, building on the discursive reaches of social Darwinism and eugenics in the 19th century, had pervaded the socio-cultural meanings of deaf education and rehabilitation. As can be discerned, the question of reformation of the disabled through their rehabilitation kept coming back. Finally, I present some concluding remarks about the conceptual crux of the arguments made so far. Transgression can be located along different and often intersecting axes of non-normativities. These range from isolated daily occurrences of disruption, such as the use of non-formal sign languages which cut through an oralist hegemony in the classroom, to vernacular iterations of educative maneuvers which pervade colonialist attempts at assimilation. Resistance can also be located in certain strong responses to the colonial state's suggestions of economic assistance in schools for the disabled, such as when Zaninotto Banerjee said to have denied in no uncertain terms an offer made by the colonial state to take over the Calcutta School for the Deaf. But perhaps the most resonant instance of resistance can be in the realization of disability futures. This futurity can be traced to the moments of self-assertion and dignity of the disabled that populate, albeit sparsely, the colonial archive, as well as to the imaginaries that are a direct result of education within indigenous schools for the disabled. Acts of disruption, whether in an individual capacity or through imagined futures, therefore, foreground disability resistance against those very constructions of colonial subjecthood, which are built on the structures of their exclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, Tirtha.
Yeah.
Any one of you, if you have questions, you can put the questions in the chat box to be taken at the end of the session. Now, our third speaker is Desire Sin Sivandar. Am I saying it right?
It's Chiwandire.
Chiwandire. Okay, thank you so much. So that's the correct one. And he is, just let me give you the brief introduction of him. And so Desire is a postdoctoral fellow in the chair for critical studies in higher education transformation at Nelson Mandela University. He holds a PhD in political and international studies from Rhodes University, where he also taught undergraduate and postgraduate courses in critical disability studies and political studies. His doctoral thesis focused on Ubuntu and the social inclusion of students with disabilities at South African universities, and has also published his academic work in refereed journals and as book chapters. His research interests broadly focus on disability politics, especially the intersectionality of race, class, gender, and disability in South African educational and workplace environment. His most recent co-edited book is titled Making the Circle Bigger: South African Higher Education, Social Justice, and Students with Disabilities. So with this note, let me just tell you what exactly he's going to speak on. And his lecture is going to be, or his presentation is going to be, Resisting Institutional Ableism at South African Universities, Students' Disability Activism and Self-Advocacy Skills. So over to you, Desire, for presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I really appreciate it. I'm just checking if I'm audible enough, and can you all see my slides?
Yes, you are audible and we can see your slides.
Okay, thank you very much. Just want to say good afternoon to all viewers. My presentation focuses mainly on the issue of resistance, how students are resisting.
We can't hear you, Desire. I think there is a connection problem.
Connection problem. He's dropped off.
Yeah.
Let's see if he rejoins.
Wait for a while, a minute or two.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Meanwhile, can we have some questions for the speakers? I'm sure he'll join soon.
Enrica, I have a question. I will put it into the chat box as well.
Okay.
In Victorian disability narratives, are there examples of empowerment or of agency of characters with disabilities that you've come across?
Okay, so as far as I'm concerned, since as I pointed out in my presentation, the role of disability in Victorian narratives is precisely that of highlighting that disabled bodies are not a part of the norm, and therefore they are marginalized. Disabled characters usually do not try to challenge those who are perceived as the archetypical stereotypes of disability, and therefore we can have, as in the case, for example, as I mentioned of Mr. Rochester in China, who is portrayed not as an heroic character, but as a rich, powerful man, and therefore there is, of course, disabled. We know after the fire accident he becomes blind and an amputee, but still he is powerful, he is rich. Also in respect to Jane, who will become, we know, his wife, who is who conforms to the norm. Say, despite the fact that she is, let's say, able-bodied, still she is portrayed as inferior to Mr. Chester, who is disabled. Therefore, I wanted to argue that there are depictions of disabled characters who are heroic, who let's say, act heroically, but still we can say that such vision of power is more linked to economy, in the sense that there are disabled characters who are men, who have power due to their economic position.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think he's just joined again.
We could move to this presentation.
Yeah.
Colleagues, my apologies.
No problem, Tirtha. You can present again.
Okay. Okay. We're having load shedding issues here. I got kicked out. Okay, just to continue, I was saying that my presentation actually focuses on the concept of resistance, resistance to institutional ableism by students with disabilities, especially those involved in disability activism, as well as the resistance of the non-disabled community, especially relevant lecturers, relevant stakeholders who are responsible for facilitating inclusive education in universities, who resist the full inclusion of students with disabilities. So this, just to talk about the presentation structure, I'm mainly interested in discussing issues of disability or student disability activism, perhaps. One could also call it campus disability activism, as well as issues of self-advocacy, firstly from an international context, then from a South African national context, as well as at an individual institutional level. So perhaps I'll begin with talking about the historical background around issues of disability inclusion in mainstream society, as well as where most countries, including South Africa, which is my focus, where South Africa is in terms of disability inclusion, both from a policies and practices standpoint. And lastly, I will talk about what needs to be done, if South Africa is going to create a conducive environment for students with disabilities to thrive. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the historical context. Perhaps this has to do with if we are to have an in-depth understanding of the field of critical disability studies, that it's important to understand the two dominant models of disability. But for purposes of this presentation, I'll apply it in our understanding of disability inclusion issues in higher education context or inclusive education. So there is a medical model of disability. So under a medical model of disability, this was when disability was framed as an individual problem which needs curing or to be fixed. So during this model, this was when countries did not have supportive legislation aimed at supporting the inclusion of persons with disabilities. So in South Africa, you find out that students with disabilities were segregated and they were educated in special schools, and there was no employment opportunities for them, which resulted in them being confined in mental health institutions. Then we see a shift in the 80s globally with the coming into effect of the social model of disability, which places more emphasis on the environment to say we can't blame an individual with a disability. We need to critically analyze on how inclusive the environment is to support persons with disabilities. So now we see more countries implementing supportive disability policies to facilitate the inclusion of students with disabilities or persons with disabilities in mainstream society. Sorry, there's someone who has a mic which is on. Do you mind muting your mic, please? Thank you. For now, I'm just going to move to South African disability policy framework for supporting students with disabilities. So I think it's important to define the concept of inclusive education. This concept is very important when we try to understand issues related to supporting learners with disabilities in educational context. So the concept of inclusive education is actually an educational approach which supports the educating of students with disabilities with their non-disabled peers in mainstream education, or perhaps what one would call the regular classroom, And in order to ensure that they succeed, there is a need to ensure that institutions provide what one would call reasonable accommodation so that the playing field can be leveled. So in the South African context, the post-apartheid South Africa came up with a new constitution, a democratic constitution, which outlaws discrimination of persons with disabilities on the grounds of disability. So you find out that education became a right for all persons, including those with disabilities. So in 1997, we see the passing of the White Paper 6, a policy which advocates for the inclusion of persons with disabilities in education. Then recently in 2018, we have the strategic policy framework. South Africa also was actually one of the countries to sign and ratify the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And then this resulted in South Africa assuming a legal obligation to support students with disabilities from an inclusive education point of view, or from what one would call a human rights approach, right? And because of this, South African universities have an obligation to constantly update their institutional disability policies to ensure that students with disabilities are fully supported. And yeah, I think it's important to understand that South African disability policy framework, like the other disability policy framework in other countries internationally, or perhaps including India, takes what one would call an academic inclusion. By academic inclusion, I mean it's an approach that places more emphasis on trying to support students in the regular classroom setting by saying that, you need to provide reasonable accommodations. We need lecturers who hold positive attitudes towards teaching students with disabilities. So in as much as this approach is okay, but I feel there is a need to also go beyond social inclusion. Because if we're just going to talk about academic inclusion, we wouldn't be having this presentation on resistance, because self-advocacy is something that could be associated with social inclusion, as in how does a student go an extra mile to ensure that the university is inclusive. So all I'm trying to say here is that it's not only about universities supporting students in the classroom setting. There's also other things that universities need to do in order to create a welcoming higher education environment for students. This could include providing extracurricular activities like sport, as well as creating a sense of belonging, both in the classroom setting and beyond the classroom setting. So just to define disability activism, I think I will define self-advocacy. What is self-advocacy? Self-advocacy is the ability to communicate one's needs and wants, and to make decisions about the support necessary to achieve them. So basically, in other words, it's very important for everyone, particularly persons with disabilities, to know how to self-advocate for their rights than always having to rely on other people. So most researchers have argued that self-advocacy is one of the important ways in which the voices of persons with disabilities resisting ableism can be heard and respected. So therefore, you very often, students with self-advocacy skills are more likely to resist oppression within their institutions. So the concept of resistance, this is a very important concept, because if you look at the field of disability studies, it originated because of the resistance, because of persons with disabilities, mainly academics and disability activists, who started to resist the way they were portrayed in the mainstream society from a medicalized point of view. Especially this resulted in formulating the social model of disability, which kind of resist oppression that they have enjoyed from the non-disabled community. So you see how important the concept of resistance is. So in terms of the methodology, this is a paper which is still in progress. So the purpose of my study was to explore issues of disability activism and self-advocacy in South African universities, because this is disability activism is one of those concepts that have not been fully investigated, because most of South African studies, they tend to focus on what I've said on academic inclusion, to try and see how students are supported in the classroom, or how students, perhaps those with physical disabilities, how they find their built environment accessible or inaccessible. So I reviewed literature. I used the methodology called document analysis to review the literature from 1994 up to date regarding issues of disability activism and self-advocacy skills. So the data were coded and analyzed using Brown and Clark's inductive and deductive thematic analysis, and critical race theory was used as a theoretical lens. Why critical race theory? Critical race theory is important because it emphasizes issues of race to say how from a historical point of view, in as much as many countries have put in place affirmative action, oriented policies, but the issue of race is still disadvantages those who were historically disadvantaged, especially in countries like America and South Africa. So I used Kamara Jones' approach to critical race theory, which has three tenets, which is institutional and structural racism that differently influences access to goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. So the concept, if you look at it from this angle, you find out that in terms of access to resources within South African universities, there's still legacies of apartheid. They are still visible in terms of how historically white universities in South Africa tends to have more resources to support students with diverse disabilities in comparison to historically Black universities. And also there's an issue of personally mediated racism between individuals, which includes intentional and unintentional prejudice, differential assumptions about abilities. So this is more about, between individuals. You find that universities, they tend to take what one would call an impairment-based approach, which I think India also takes from the literature that I read some time ago, where there's that issue of supporting students that universities feel that they are less costly to support. And in many cases is perhaps always students with physical disabilities in comparison to deaf students, because universities don't want to invest in hiring sign language interpreters. Then there's also internalized racism or acceptance of negative messages by members of a stigmatized race. So this is also evident in my findings, where students who don't have self-advocacy skills, they end up accepting that there's nothing that they can do in order to change the oppressive practices of their universities, And then when it comes to the findings, the study yielded 3 dominant findings. So the first finding has mainly to do with students who are not involved in disability activism. So you find out that most of the literature, they say from the global north, they say most students in first world countries, they are more involved in disability activism because there's what you call high level of awareness, and education around their rights to inclusive education. And as you know that first world countries implemented disability inclusion legislation in the 70s, 80s, much earlier than global south countries. So this was also evident in this study that in most universities, students still don't have self-advocacy skills. And because of this, they often run the risk of dropping out. And some of them, they feel that the only way to cope within the university setting is to be resilient, is to work extra hard and not wanting to cause trouble. So you will hear from their narratives, they will say such things as like, you know what, I'm here to get my degree. I'm just going to work hard, get my degree and leave. I don't want to be involved in student politics. I just want to spend more time doing work, pass, get my degree and go to work. So in a way, they have kind of accepted that there's nothing that they can do about changing the oppressive environment. Then there are also others, and also this resulted from the fact that some students don't know that they have rights, that there's the concept of inclusive education is a full right, to them. Because in as much as South Africa has implemented a lot of disability policy legislation, but they have not done much at a national level as well as at an institutional level to raise awareness, to educate students with disabilities about their rights and what they should do if they feel that their rights are being they are being discriminated against on the grounds of race and disability. And also the intersectionality of race was also evident because I found out that students with disabilities from historically Black universities don't engage in self-advocacy skills in comparison to those in historically white universities. I think this is very evident in South Africa. Even when you look at Fees Must Fall, it was mainly students in historically white universities who were more visible, or whatever they say, was gaining more attention in social media or mainstream media in comparison to those in historically Black universities. So because of this, I think there's a need to empower and educate students with disabilities to rather to be independent, to self-advocate for their rights, rather than having to rely on someone else. Then we found out that there was also students who would rely on other stakeholders whom they felt could sympathize with them to self-advocate on their behalf. And in many cases, these students relied on disability unit staff members, what one would call disability coordinators. I'm sure for those who are not familiar with disability staff members, these are staff members who are responsible to facilitate the inclusion of students at universities by liaising with lecturers, students, and other relevant stakeholders. So in my research, I found out that most disability unit staff members, especially those with disabilities, they were very active and, they would fearlessly play a watchdog role against lecturers or other staff members who would try to violate the rights of students with disabilities, and champion the rights of students with disabilities. Then other disability unit staff members,
I think we have lost the connection again.
Sorry, I was just about to wrap up. How many minutes do I have left?
You can carry on, yeah.
Yes, I was talking about students who rely on disability unit staff members to self-advocate for them. Then others will rely on their lecturers, especially lecturers who are empathetic towards the inclusion of students with disabilities. And some of these lecturers were lecturers with disabilities as well. Then other students were relying on one student who had self-advocacy skills. Maybe this student is in the SRC and he or she is pro-disability inclusion. So they would always go to that student to go and speak to the VC or other relevant stakeholders who could create change for this group. And then lastly, there were students with self-advocacy skills. And mainly, most of these students were those in SRC, you know, in societies for students with disabilities, most of which are in historically white universities, at Rhodes University, Wits, Stellenbosch University, where else? University of Pretoria. So these are societies for students with disabilities, you know, which play an important role in advocating for disability inclusion rights, as well as students in house coms who were also involved in disability activism. You know, students with good self-advocacy skills have advocated for reasonable accommodations from their lecturers. Some of them have even engaged the university management, you know, about issues that they are not happy with. There's also the intersectionality of race and disability, where white students from middle-class background, including Black students, they are more involved in self-advocacy initiatives in comparison to their peers with from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So it was more about confidence and knowing the language, you know, because this disability activism, you also need to have a skill, you know, and to advocate for your rights effectively, you know. So also one thing that I noticed, the limitation about this is that students who are involved in disability activism, they tend to advocate for their disability or for students with a similar disability. So you find out that if a student is a physical disability, she or he will pay more attention on accessibility. Or if she's a blind student, she will pay more attention on assistive devices, which they couldn't cut across the board. Not all of them. So in terms of conclusions and recommendations, it's important. I noticed that disability activism, having disability activism skills is important, you know, for students to resist an oppressive higher education context, right? And students who have acquired these skills, stand a better chance to resist institutional ableism, you know, and create a conducive environment for them to succeed academically. Let's say if the lecturer is not supporting them, they will confront that lecturer, you know, and speak about what they need in order for them to succeed, right? And I think the most important thing that we need here is disability mainstreaming. South African policies have been talking about the need to mainstream disability issues in higher education, you know, so that in order to prevent a situation whereby disability inclusion issues is resisted by relevant stakeholders. So disability inclusion mainstreaming would mean that university management should also support disability inclusion issues through injecting funding, you know, on disability inclusion issues. And also it should be everyone's responsibility, every non-disabled member responsibility to ensure that, universities are inclusive for students with disabilities. And lastly, I think, as I said from the beginning, that I look at resistance as a two-edged sword. Like, students who use resistance can create a conducive environment for them to learn, and lecturers also need to avoid resisting the full inclusion of students with disabilities. So by this I mean that universities should be proactive rather than reactive in resisting forces of resistance. So by this I mean universities should remove disabling institutional barriers if they are to create a conducive environment for all students with disabilities to self-advocate for their rights. I've spoken about the need for funding allocation, which prioritize disability inclusion, putting in place monitoring mechanism to ensure constant systematic disability policy implementation. So in South Africa, I find out that there is no systematic approach for disability inclusion. So disability inclusion is achieved based on the resources that the institution has at its disposal, whether it's a historically white or historically black institution. So there's a need to equalize the provision of resources so that we prevent a situation whereby students are always protesting or fighting for their rights, which are enshrined in the Constitution and international human rights instruments. I think there's also a need to revise national and institutional disability policies in consultation with students with disabilities so that we avoid a future a situation whereby students are always resisting, to fight for their rights. Yeah, I think that's all from my presentation. I look forward to engaging with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Desire, for giving us the perspective from about South African, spaces. If there are any questions, I would like you to either give the questions in the chat box or raise your hand so that we can have a discussion. We still have a time. Any questions, please? From all the three speakers, I'm sure the speakers are around. Okay, Tirtha, I have a question for Desire. Desire, are you there?
Yes.
Yeah, so I'll read out the question for you. Tirtha, you can ask your questions, or do you want me to? Okay, I'll just read the question. You spoke on the intersection of race and disability in context of students' advocacy in South Africa. I wanted to know how race figures in national disability legislation policies in South Africa, considering the violent history of apartheid.
Thank you for that question. As far as I can respond to your question is that when it comes to race in South Africa, the post-apartheid disability policies, they took race seriously, the issue of race or the intersectionality of disability and race. So that's why you find out that there was the emphasis on the need to redress the historical past and give more opportunities to those who were discriminated against in the past. But what seems to happen is that the issue of transformation or redress is more of a numbers game, where more attention is paid on just giving Black students and Indian students access, but there's not much which is being done to support them effectively to ensure that they succeed on an equal basis with their non-disabled peers. So that's why you find out that even up to now, most students who still have full access to higher education opportunities are white students, those who were privileged in the past. This is also because of the issue of basic education. More attention in South Africa is placed on giving, providing students with disabilities with scholarships to access higher education, and also giving them employment opportunities, through the Employment Equity Act. But there is not much that is being done on basic level, basic education and secondary education. So that on its own result in most Black students, especially girls, not having access to basic education. And that subsequently result in them not accessing higher education opportunities. And the issue of special schools in South Africa, we still have public special schools are under-resourced in comparison to private special schools, which most white students, white learners have access to, So in reality, on the top, in as much as the policy advocates for, disability inclusion, which emphasizes historically marginalized races, but in practice, how it plays out, Black students are still discriminated against. White students still have more opportunities. I think it's an issue of economic resources and the fact that most Black people or poor persons with disabilities are born in impoverished families. So the legacies of apartheid are still felt in that regard. I don't know if I have responded to your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Desire. Anyone else with a question? Or a comment? If there is nothing more to do, I will like to thank, Enrica, Tirtha, and Desire for giving us some perspective of what is happening at an educational level at various time periods. And I've frankly enjoyed the talk because for me, everything was kind of new, but still a lot to learn. And last but not the least, I would request everybody to be there for the valedictory function at 5 p.m.
Could I just interrupt? There is one more presentation, ma'am, actually. Himashree is here, the fourth one.
Okay. Himashree, there is a fourth one?
Yeah, she's here.
Okay. So, I don't know. I was given 3, but doesn't matter. We'll have a fourth one. So we have one more presentation, and I would like to talk about Himashree. Himashree, I hope I have your bio sketch.
Yes, ma'am.
I must be.
I hope I'm audible.
Yes, Himashree, we can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, so you can carry on, Himashree, and tell us the topic in which you want to speak on.
My topic is about the reconfiguration of disability in one of science fiction novels. So it is Manjula Padmanabhan's Island of Lost Girls. So, it is a dystopian science fiction, and it reconfigures the popular perceptions of disability by contesting or resisting the idea of what constitutes a normal body and as well as mind, and challenging the stereotypes and prejudices against the disabled. Now, I must reiterate here that I'm reading a novel, and it is a dystopian science fiction novel. And as a genre, science fiction has always mirrored the present and criticized the politics and ideologies of the current day, as its writers imagine the possibilities of the future worlds. Catherine Allen, she has edited a book titled Disability in Science Fiction. And in there, she has said that the genre of science fiction has a particular affinity with disability. Starting with the Frankenstein monster in Mary Shelley's novel, science fiction has long explored divined and disabled bodies. Elaine Graham also recognizes a natural affinity between science fiction and disability studies, as both invest in the investigation of ontologies. She says that as reflections of the same as evidence, for the ascribed and not essential nature of human nature. Monsters, aliens, and others provide clues for the moral economy or ontological hygiene by which future categories of the human/post-human and non-human might be decided. Thus, with evocations of both the post-human and the non-human, the genre of science fiction allows for infinite variations of embodiment. Alan adds that while the settings and temporal framework of science fiction may differ dramatically from our own current reality, the way in which disability and people with disabilities are portrayed or represented in science fiction novels often directly represent present-day biases and stereotypes. Now, this is not to say that science fiction writers have always had, positive depictions of people with disabilities, but it must be acknowledged that it is a genre replete with representations of the divine and impaired bodies. Now, the title island of the novel that I'm reading is home to an exclusive and motley group of disabled and disfigured women with their acquired disabilities, which they sustained due to rampant gender violence. The novel is a sensitive and nuanced treatment of what it means to be disabled and how to live as persons with people with disabilities. The disabled women in the island undergo a transformation, a movement from an abject regard of their disabled bodies to a celebration of difference and other ways of being. The Lost Girls work out modes of resistance against hegemonic ideas pertaining to perfect female bodies and ableism. We see a form of institutionalized self-fashioning being enforced here, wherein the newcomers are given an orientation on the way to take control of one's identity as a disabled person. The few girls who qualify to be admitted into the island are partially dead with missing limbs, missing internal body parts, unable to sit or stand, eat, etc. The bodies are stitched together and with recycled body parts of girls who arrived dead. All of them need psychological and social rehabilitation before being sent out into the world. When Meiji, the protagonist of the novel, wakes up in the recovery room, she sees that the bodies of other girls lying around her, and she notices they are crisscrossed with black stitches. Some of them are like rag dolls whose bodies had been sewn together from a collection of spare parts. The attendants who were looking after them also had weird and lumpy bodies. Now, Leonard Davis, he said that the problem lies not with the person with disability, but the problem is the way normalcy is constructed to create the problem of the disabled person. And one of the tasks for a developing consciousness of disability issues is the attempt to reverse the hegemony of the normal and to institute alternative ways of thinking about the abnormal. Now, one of the ways in which this transpires in the novel is in the culture of nudity, which is encouraged in the island of Lost Girls. It is a part of the process to rid the girls of their bodily inhibitions. Vane, one of the council leaders in the island, she says that this helps in envisaging bodies as instruments of social change and flattens the curve of deceit and vanity. The second reason, she says, is more complex. She says to the girls, you are perhaps aware that your presence in the island has a specific cause, a trauma, a wounding, an assault. Most of you who have come here have known enormous damage. I mean, she says this to the girls who enter the island. You have newly entered the island, and these once perfect bodies are prisons for the spirit. And some of the girls have scars, some have missing limbs, traces of physical wounds, as well as invisible wounds. And as the candidates, as they reveal their bodies, we see that, we see lots of the damages sustained, such as in the form of scars, in the form of zigzag marks, in the form of a mechanical prosthesis, etc., etc. Now, the rehabilitations, it must be kept in mind, the rehabilitations that happen in the island is not a normative rehabilitation, but a non-normative rehabilitation of the body. Now, the enfreakment of the disabled and disfigured body which is harnessed in the novel for a strategic end, as the non-disabled gaze of the reader is disturbed and interrogated. The spectacle of disabled bodies in the novel becomes a profound moment when women own up their damaged bodies, their disabilities, which they have acquired in their lifetime. Vane, the council leader, their mentor, she continues to educate and teach the lost girls by emphasizing that they need to accept their bodies with all their wounds, with all their scars, weaknesses, and infirmities. She says to them, you need to own your bodies before you can heal completely. The novel thus shows how ableist constructions of impairment can be resisted and challenged. The girls in the island are made to confront physical and attitudinal barriers, question standard body image and ideas of feminine attractiveness. As the girls are taught or immunized against the pervasive notions of both physical and mental normalcy, we see them growing into their new disabled identities through a celebration of their difference. Disability is worn as a mark or badge of belonging to other or plural ways of being. And not just in fiction, but in contemporary society as well, we see this happening, wherein disabled people are resisting stereotypes about the invalid, and they reconfigure themselves in ways that challenge years of discrimination by refusing to internalize ableism and demanding recognition for themselves by adopting disability as a positive identity. And as exemplified in the novel, prosthesis and the post-human figure largely in science fictional representations of disability. The prosthesis, which makes one a post-human, has significant resonance for both disability studies and science fictional studies. A prosthetic, as is known, is a tool that corrects an impairment. Sibers said that while no one questions able-bodied people using tools and technologies to make their lives easier, the technologies designed to make a disabled person's life easier are viewed as expensive additions, unnecessary accommodations, and a burden on society. If mainstream representations of prostheticized disabled bodies have been seen as a reassertion of a certain idea of normativity, science fiction challenges these ideas by exploring how science and technology unsettles the assumed limits of what constitutes the normal human body as they put forward non-normative bodied individuals. Invisible wounds or psychological damages are treated in the novel with something called memories, wherein traumatic memories are erased. Vane, the council leader, she admits that this method has been resented and is problematic, and therefore she keeps the option of memory restoration intact and ready at hand. But we see that there have been instances in the novel when the novitiates, they committed suicide after memory restoration. Anyway, this whole thing and the focus on mental disabilities as well shows that there's an equal attention paid to psychological wounds as well, though the radical methods involved or shown represented in the novel about the way one goes about treating them are questionable. Vane says to one of the newcomers or guests to visit the island for the first time that the island is not a health spa. She says, we are not doing cosmetic surgery here. The direct opposite, the girls who arrive here have faced the worst and most horrific forms of disfigurement, torture, and assault, and our aim is to return them to something like normalcy. Now, it must be kept in mind that the normalcy that Wayne is talking about is a new normal for the disabled, not the normative normal, if I can say that. As the novel shows, science fiction may be particularly useful to disability studies in the context of the representation of the disabled in literature, as it often takes the abnormal body and reimagines its usefulness. Instead of viewing bodily variation as a deviancy, many science fiction texts reframe the disabled body as not only monstrous, but also adaptive and subversive. Ria Shane says regarding this subject that the pairing of disability and science fiction is an immensely fruitful one. She writes, with its potential to depict alternative corporealities, new technologies, and changed social realities, science fiction offers a space in which notions of disability, health, and what constitutes a normal human body and mind can be challenged and reconceptualized. Patrick Parinder also similarly notes that science fiction helps one imagine strange worlds through which we come to see our own conditions of life in a new and potentially revolutionary perspective. Catherine Allen therefore says that a critical engagement with representations of disability in the genre enriches our understanding of both disability and science fiction itself. There are thus exciting and productive possibilities and subversive potentials in the dialogue between disability and post-humanism as well. As we see in the novel, the post-human figure not only serves as a form of resistance and against the normative body, but also as a mode of transgression. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Himashree, for your presentation. And again, I'll request if there are any questions, put them in a chat box, please. In any way, if you want to interact and have a comment for any presentation. If none, then I declare this session over. And let's meet at 5 o'clock for a valedictory function. So thank you everyone for being here and for seeing the session to the conclusion. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you,
Professor Brar. Thank you so much, and thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all.
And thank you to Vishal and Ajit also for being here with us. Thanks a lot.